I want to explain about the nature of language change. According to Raymond 2003, says that any treatment of linguistics must address the question of language change. The way languages change offers insight into the natural language itself. The possible answers to why languages change tell us about the way language is used in society, about how it is acquired by individuals, and may reveal to us information about its internal organization. There is no simple explanation for why languages change. This is an area in which there is much speculation and little proof. The area is an interesting and one, but there are few, if any, direct answers. For this reason, historical linguistics has traditionally been concerned with how language evolve and not why they do so in one particular direction and not in the another. To begin this section, a number of statements about language change are being made. First, all language change. There is no such thing as language which is not changing. The rate of change may vary considerably due to both internal and external factors. English, for example, has changed greatly since Old English. Other languages like Finnish and Icelandic have changed little over the centuries. The second is language change is largely regular. One can recognize regularities in the types of change which language undergo, even if this cannot be predicted. The next material will be explanation by Sukma.
Okay, thank you Dinda for your great explanation. So hello guys, I'm Sukmawati as the next presenter of this group. I'm going to explain about historical linguistics. So many histories of linguistics have been written since the 19th and 70s. So there are two theories about history of linguistics. The first is traditional linguistics. So the expert of traditional linguistics is Plato and Aristotle. Traditional linguistics analyzes language based on philosophy and semantics. So the history of traditional linguistics, the first is Greek period. Traditional linguistics had been known in Greek period. It is about 5th before century until 2nd century. So there was debate among linguists. First is natural and conventional language. Naturalists argued that every word has relation to thing, while conventionalists argued that language is conventionally. It means the meaning of word is obtained from traditional result and habitual. It may be changed. And the second is analogy and anomaly. Plato and Aristotle are analogists. They say that language is regular, so people can manage of grammar, but anomalism has argument that language is irregular. For example, child is not childs, but children, and etc. And then the second of traditional linguistics is Roman period. It is study of language in Roman period is continuation of Greek period. In this period, Pharaoh 116 until 27 before century wrote the Lingua Latina, and Persia had institutions grammaticae. And then the third is Middle Age. In this period, in Europe has concern of language study, especially scholastic philosopher. Latin language became lingua franca because it was a crutch, diplomatic and science language. And then the fourth is Renaissance. Many scholars were mastering of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic. They are also arranged of grammar and made comparison. And then the fifth is pre until modern linguistics. And this period has important history. There is relation of Sanskrit to Greek, Latin, and the other German language. And then the second theory of historical linguistics is structural linguistics. In critical theory, structuralism is a theoretical paradigm positing that elements of human culture must be understood in terms of their relationship to a larger, overarching system or structure. So Ferdinand de Saussure is a master of structural linguistics. He wrote Curse the Linguistic General book. He said that the concept of linguistic in the book is the first diachronic language. Diachronic literally means historically. It has 5 main concerns, such as to describe and account for observed change in particular languages, and then to reconstruct the prehistory of languages and determine their relatedness, grouping them into language families, to develop general theories about how and why language changes, to describe the history of speech communities, and then the last to study the history of words. The second is synchronic. Synchronic study of language is to learn a language at a certain period of time only, while the diachronic study of language is the study of language of all time or long time that language is used by speakers. The third is la langue and la parole. The last sensory idea to be considered is the distinction between parole or speech and langue or language. Speech is the way people actually talk, as it proceeds in the interaction order. Langue is an idealized or formalized version of the way people actually talk, with standardized semantics, idealized syntax, and a purified set of linguistic rules. While language is simplified and academically more approachable version of speech. In this respect, it has some resemblance with Weber's ideal types, which try to get at the underlying meaning and tendencies of historical realities. So, historical linguistic studies how languages change or maintain their structure during the course of time, while descriptive linguistics investigates and attributes to the linguistic data a uniform status of linguistic simultaneity without any regard for time factor. I think that's all from me. Thank you. So go back to the next presenter. Thank you.
The next one is structural linguistic. According to Saussure in his book, he is the master of structural linguistic. He wrote Curse the Linguistic General book, There are several concepts in this book. The first one is diachronic language. It's actually mean historicalling. There are five main concerns. The first one is to describe an account for observed changes in particular languages. It's basically jadi ini menjelaskan dan menggambarkan hasil analisa perubahan dari bahasa tertentu. The next one is to reconstruct the prehistory of languages and determine their relativeness, grouping them into languages families. The next one is untuk membentuk bahasa sebelumnya dan menjelaskan hubungannya. Selain itu juga membagi ke dalam grup beberapa bahasa tertentu. The next one is to develop general theories about how and why language change. Ini mengembangkan teori umum tentang bagaimana dan kenapa bahasa itu berubah. The next one is to describe the history of speak communities. And the last is to study the history of words. The next one is the next concept from Saussure is synchronic. Synchronic study of language is to learn a language at a certain period of time only, while the diachronic study, like I explained before, is the study of language of all time or long time that language is used by speaker. So it just for certain several times, not all the time. And the last is about the last concept is la language and la parole. The last Saussurean idea to be considered is the distinction between parole or speak and language, or speak is the way people actually talk as it proceeds in the interaction order. Language is simplified and academically more approachable version of speak. The next part is about language change and development. There are two factors in language change. There are internal and external factor, which in my opinion, internal is come from ourselves and the external is comes from the environment. These factors are different in themselves. For example, internal factors have very often to do with establishment of morphological regularity, and external factors have primarily to do with the symbolic role of language and society. So, in the internal language changes internally occur in the behavior of speakers in their everyday lives to adjust to each other, and followed by tendency to innovate in groups of people who are already familiar, then followed by other changes in sequence, which ultimately makes a language different each other, although originally derived from a single language family. As I mentioned before, it comes from the speaker behavior in internal language change in their everyday life and their experiences. To investigate further about language change and development, internally the writer will explore of English and German language change and development in some periods as follows. The evolution of English language occurs in 15th centuries continually in English. Well, there are for dialect, there are Northumbrian, Mercian, West Saxon, and Kentish. Basically, the difference between Old English, Modern English is spelling, pronounce, vocal, and structure. The document indicated there was struggle of dominance in German. This phenomenon had success to made Latin translation draft and process it. The next is external language change. So it in this change we will be explored through the study of sociolinguistics by examining and looking at changes and developments that language is influenced by sociocultural factors that occur in society. So basically, it's like the environment of the speaker affect the change in this case. Changes in the external language change and language development is caused by the contact of language with other languages, where humans as social beings who have been cultured either interconnected or interethnic nations in the world in a country. They have many purposes in interaction and activities. For example, economy, politics, religion, science, acculturation of culture, technology, and etc. There are also another example of external change is the development of colloquially of synthetic forms of auxiliary verbs, particularly in American English. Phonetic reduction leads to a fusion of two, with preceding verb from as in going to become a gonna as we know, or want to become wanna. Whether this will ever be accepted in more standard varieties of English depends ultimately on language attitudes and the readiness to accept vernacular forms. The next material will be delivered by my friends.
So the next material is change and level of language. Language change over evidence for the autonomy but interconnection of linguistic levels. While there is general consensus on the organization of language as an arrangement of subsystems, there is equal insistence on the fact that these subsystems have definite points of connection. Although the sound and meaning system of a language are separate, there are definite links between the two. For instance, if there is phonological attrition in a language, then this may well lead to the opacity of lexical forms, which in turn can lead to later reinterpretation, as with the many instances of folk etymology. So, before looking at the individual levels of language, it is important to point out that in recent research, linguists have stressed gradients of grammatical categories. In English, for example, there is a common practice of using nouns in attributive adjective position, which leads functionally to a change in class, for example, with fun as in a fun party. This is still within a single level of language, that syntax, but it does show that there is a degree of fluidity among categories, something which is long established in English and is perhaps characteristic of analytical language as a whole. The next is about phonological change. So, on a pure phonetic level, one could say that sound change has to do with an increase or decrease in sonority. Segments are usually strengthened in syllable initial position and weakened in medial and final position. It is one of the great merits of nonlinear phonology to have over a formal framework for describing these types of change, that is developments which are dependent on syllable structure and syllable position. And the next is morphological change. For many languages, morphology is mediated between deep syntactic hash and surface realization. It is obvious that there is no language without syntax and phonology, but there are languages with little morphology. This fact might seem to suggest that morphology is not part of universal grammar, at least that it can remain unrealized. Surface morphology can be seen as the result of performance phenomena such as phonetic attrition, leading in the fullness of time to cliticization and grammaticalization. It is defined as a level of language as it is manifest on the surface, and indeed there is a sense in which in those languages with morphology that is a level which can be a ranking above phonetics. Although the ultimate status of morphology can be debated because it is not necessary for human language, it is nonetheless a reality for all language types apart from analytical languages. And the last is about syntactic change. In an overview chapter, such as present on the one, it is possible to do justice to the vast theme of syntactic change. So, all that one can do in current context is to point some general feature of the phenomenon and advise readers to consult the relevant literature for detailed discussion of instance and interpretation of syntactic change. It should also be mentioned that syntactic change tends to be the domain of language with a more formal orientation. Functional views of language change are often associated with a sociolinguistic or typological approach to the field. There is an essential difference between phonological and syntactic change, in that syntactic variables do not occur as frequently as phonological ones. Syntactic variation is more likely to be conditioned by internal linguistic factor or depends on question of style and context rather than external social factors, since syntactic structures are repeated less often than phonological ones and are thus less available for social assessment. Furthermore, syntactic factors are less visible as the structure which they engender are more abstract and hence speakers are less conscious of them. Syntactic structure do not usually have a social identification function like phonological factor, as there many well be stretches of speech in which a given syntactic variable does not occur at all and hence does not offer a speaker a clue as to the linguistic affiliation of an interlocutor. So there's all for us. Thank you.